Hello, my name is Joanna Karaman, and I am hosting this episode of the Landscape Architecture Podcast, which was recorded on site at ASLA's 2018 annual conference in Philadelphia. This episode features Kofi Boone, professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning at NC State University College of Design. He focuses on the changing nature of communities and developing tools for enhanced community engagement and design.
I'm Kofi Boone. I am an associate professor of landscape architecture at NC State University in Raleigh, and I serve on the board of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My mother is an artist, and my grandfather was a self-taught artist, and so I kind of grew up in a household where art was a thing. But in high school, I wanted to be a professional musician, and in Michigan, there's a school called Interlochen Center for the Arts, which is sort of a performing arts high school. So I moved, it was a boarding school, so I went from Detroit to Traverse City, which is not Detroit, surrounded by lakes and woods and other things. And it was my first experience being in that particular environment. And I took an ecology class when I was there and discovered this whole world of, we were tagging songbirds and eating wild edible plants, and it's just stuff that just had never occurred to me. And in my head, I was kind of like, is there some way to bridge these worlds together? And I went for a college visit at Michigan, and for the first time vocalized it to the chagrin of my parents. And they were wise enough to say, we actually have a school of natural resources on campus, and you can go and talk to a counselor there. And so I went as a high school rising senior, and they mentioned landscape architecture, and that the chair of that department, a guy named Ken Polakowski, who was on sabbatical at that time, but when he got back, he was going to give me a call. And I said, yeah, sure, this guy's going to give me a call. But he did, and he gave me a summer job that summer. His specialty was zoo design, and he was doing research on human behavior at zoo exhibits, like how people engaged. So he told me, you go to the zoo every day, and he taught me how to do behavior mapping, taught me how to use a 35 millimeter camera, take pictures, and we'll talk once a week. You can show me what you got. And so literally sitting on his porch as a high school senior, he was sort of talking about all the virtues of landscape architecture. And Michigan does not have an undergrad program. I ended up getting a bachelor's in natural resources, but ended up going into the MLA program there, so 7 years there. And then I worked professionally. I had an internship at Carroll Johnson Associates in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was very influential on me in a lot of ways. And I spent 10 years at Smith Group JGR before relocating to the South and taking a teaching position at NC State.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's such an interesting story. It's great to hear that you found out about this in high school, because many people don't discover landscape architecture until they get to college. And there's always those few key influential people that kind of guide you along the way. Yeah,
I think that if he had not reached out and grabbed me, that probably wouldn't be in the profession right now. But it was a point of, you're exactly right. Many people that I know in the profession, they had a similar experience where someone was in the right place at the right time to direct that energy to the profession. So, and I'm thankful for it because I think it was a good fit.
Well, you have achieved a number of things in your academic career, but since we're here at ASLA 2018 in Philadelphia, I wanted to ask you about a project that you were a part of that is receiving a communications award this year. That project's called Homeplace, and it is called A Guide for Conversation with 6 different North Carolina communities after they were hit by Hurricane Matthew in 2016. Can you talk about how this project came to be and what the results are of this effort 2 years later?
Yeah, so at NC State, my good colleague and friend, Andy Fox, and landscape architecture and architecture professor David Hill started what was called the Coastal Design Dynamics Lab, and they were concerned with really, in our state, a lack of design attention to a lot of the impacts of climate change. And we have a lot of political reasons why, which could be a whole nother podcast. But in short, they wanted to insert design, and they started partnering with communities on the coast. After Hurricane Matthew occurred, most of the devastation was inland. meaning that the hurricane hit the coast, and that's kind of what gets the press. But what really ends up happening in communities that are about 100 miles away from the coast is a week later, all the water runs downhill from places like where we are in the Triangle and inundates them, and they don't get the press or the attention. And since they're not associated with the coast, there really weren't any mechanisms to deal with what their concerns were. So Andy and David parlayed their relationship with a group out of UNC Chapel Hill called the Coastal Resilience Center, and they provided some discretionary funding for us post-Matthew to engage in these communities. These were the hardest hit based on their analysis. And what we learned was, maybe they didn't need, I'll put it a different way. There are lots of examples of designers coming in and in a short period of time generating final design ideas to kind of solve the problem. But what we uncovered was that these communities, in many cases, even decision makers didn't know the basics. So what is a floodplain? How do you identify, why does this keep happening? How many times has it happened? What are the costs that we've incurred? What are different choices we can make? So we actually started with a discussion about a pattern book, which I think is more common, where you kind of show, it's this kind of house and it's this kind of space. And we kind of paused on that and we said, that's not really what's needed right now. We need to build like a basic tool to help them have conversations that build everyone's awareness of not just the situation, but what their choices are. So, we started by, and thinking about it at different scales, which I think makes it unique too. So dealing with the dwelling or the house and the site, and then like your neighborhood, and then, the region. So we partner with some non-traditional partners. We had a graphic designer with us from the beginning to help us sort of take the jargon out of what we were doing and help us with some graphic standards that are more readily accessible to most people. And we were struggling with a name. And in North Carolina, Homeplace is like a vernacular term that they use, particularly in Eastern North Carolina, about, you ask somebody where they're from, they'll tell you their home place. And so selfishly, as landscape architects, we were like, okay, we're not just talking about the house, we need some kind of word that brings place to it. And so we actually kind of named it based on that local vernacular. And since it's occurred, it's been distributed to several other communities. We've been able to try out some of it in a town called Princeville. Princeville is the oldest African-American black town in the United States, repeatedly vulnerable community to flooding and inundation just because of where they are. So we were able to take that document and use it for a week-long workshop with people in the community and a number of experts to try and use it to help the community generate some solutions to that particular problem. We are currently working with the town of Lumberton, which is another Homeplace community, on a similar effort, and then the other four, as funding and time allow.
I'm wondering how some of those conversations played out with those communities. For example, Princeville, I think I remember reading in one of your articles that they are located there because they were the land in the floodplain was the only land that was available for that black community to buy, whereas the wealthier white communities took the higher grounds.
That's right.
So when you talk about adaptation techniques such as relocation,
right. Yeah, we ran headlong into it, and it was very difficult in Princeville, and it turns out it's not specific to that community. It's sort of magnified that a lot of people who with no choice of their own were the only option they had was whatever you consider a marginal area. There's a really important paper by a few geographers that talk about this topic of racialized topography, which is this phenomenon. So they studied over 100 southern U.S. cities, and found that with a few exceptions that you could predict race and ethnicity based on altitude, how high or low people were in those communities. And that phenomenon they called racialized topography. And I actually had a chance to run that analysis on a number of the communities we've worked with, and it bears out. And that's the reason why, is if you think about the founding of a lot of these towns, the highest ground was claimed by the most powerful and the wealthiest at the time, which were essentially white people. At the time they were founded, African people were enslaved and had no rights. They were property. But ironically, their lifestyle was dependent upon economic systems that proximity to white communities. So for example, in Princeville, it is on the low side of the Tar River, The high side across the river is Tarboro, and so that is the white town. But people in Princeville were, engaged in timber manufacturing and other things that they bought and sold and traded with whites, but which forced the proximity, but they weren't able to enjoy the benefits in their homes. So Princeville in particular started as Freedom Hill. It was right after the Civil War, sold to by a former plantation owner to a man named Turner Prince, and that's the basis of the name Princeville. And there are sort of folk stories of, they filled in a swamp essentially to build this town, but there was a tremendous amount of pride. And, the only thing that I think we can do is present the trade-offs of the choices that they make, in which case it's very hard to tell someone what to do. And in the workshop, we tried not to do that. So, for example, we said, of course, the historic town is really important. And we uncovered through the analysis during the workshop that even though it had been hit by many floods and hurricanes, each time after the population increased from the previous level, which is to say right before Hurricane Matthew, Princeville was the largest population it had ever been. So that narrative of disinvestment, people retreating and moving away, not caring about the town, actually was not true. And that was a really important sort of common sort of trust building sort of revelation. And what we proposed, which is what the state is attempting to pursue now, was to acquire annex land adjacent to the current town of Princeville to grow the town of Princeville. And that annex land is high ground. And so it's not abandoning your town, it's growing your town and then adapting the mix so that you're still in Princeville, you still have that connection to your town, but you're in less harm. And so that's in negotiation now at the state level to figure out how to do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, one of the things I admire about the approach in this communication strategy was focusing on the people first and making sure they understand that it's not, like you mentioned, a top-down design approach where designers come in with a solution that they need to sell to the community. And I assume that this is an approach that carries throughout many of your environmental justice work, correct?
Try to. I think, as we talk about the birth of mainstream environmentalism in American history, particularly with cities, where was everybody else? Where were the women and what were they doing? Where was, labor unions and workers, what were they doing? And where were people of color? And it turns out that there were lots of people working, but their definition of the environment was different. In which case, the mainstream environmental movement was more focused on preservation of landscapes that were untouched by human beings. And so this is the national park movement. This is, big preservation concerns. At the same time, women's groups, worker groups, people of color were talking about like sanitation and safety and housing. And so these didn't really fit within the mainstream definition of environmentalism, but definitely not landscape architecture. And so I think part of the ground up community engaged piece is an acknowledgement of that as we have traditionally defined our boundaries, that there are people on the margins who are excluded just based on how we define them. And that, we followed as a profession, innovations happen in planning. So the advocacy planning movement happens in the 1930s, where for the first time planners are going to communities not with determined plans, but listening, and trying to build, that kind of stuff. Architecture, it's after Whitney Young gives a famous keynote address in 1968 to the AIA, where he literally uses that keynote address to tell AIA everything that's wrong about what they're doing. This is the 50th anniversary of that great speech, but that's the birth of the Community Design Center movement of architecture now getting into participation tools. And landscape architecture in some ways was behind. You can trace some parts to, work of Garrett Ekbo, working with worker housing in California. That's sort of a precedent, but it really doesn't get its strength until Randy Hester, who actually developed a lot of his techniques while he was at NC State, but wrote about it in Berkeley, and so Berkeley gets more of the credit essentially for that. But that idea of engaging communities, listening, not coming with pre-imposed, coming up with tools that help them with language, with understanding how we think, but also help us understand how they think. That's the 70s is really the golden era of the development of a lot of these tools. So I think it's really important. I don't think it replaces expertise, and I think that the pendulum is switching that way, where at one point in time, expertise was the enemy of the community, and it was adversarial and confrontational. But I think that there are a number of folks, particularly your generation and younger, who have a stronger sort of social mission, social ethic for a lot of reasons, and are able to kind of balance that a little better. And so what I like now about it is that we can actually talk about our expertise. We don't have to be just passive recipients of community information. We can actually engage in a dialogue once trust is built. And I'm excited about that potential.
So when we asked you where your current passions lie, you mentioned the fourth R in Earth Day, repair. And I'm wondering if you could expand on this a little bit more, where that word initially came from and how you see it playing out in your work.
The person I heard that from was a woman named Wangari Maathai, who's the first PhD in forestry, female PhD in forestry from Yale, and also the first African woman to get a PhD in forestry from Yale, and also the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So she's a powerhouse. Sadly passed away. But her legacy was in Kenya, where she wanted to find ways to make the environmental tools that we kind of take for granted helpful to women, particularly in poverty in her country. And she discovered that a majority of their time was spent, retrieving firewood, and they were doing all these unsustainable processes, chopping down young trees and that sort of thing, just for survival. So she enlists this group of women to build what's called now the Green Belt movement, to teach them, sustainable forestry practices in the interest of increasing their power and food security and all these things that aren't like directly tied to the environment, but are necessary in order for people to have a healthy relationship with it. And they've planted. The number is like, I say it, and I still am like, that's not possible. They planted 100 million trees since that time, and they've done like satellite photography where it's actually pushed back desertification over time, where it's reversed it like at a regional scale. It's just unbelievable stuff. So anyway, they asked her remarks on Earth Day. And the 3 R's that everyone's familiar with is, reuse, recycle, and reduce. And she's like, I want to add a fourth one. The fourth one is repair. And she's like, well, really a lot of our job at that time in the early 21st century was repairing the harm that was done in previous eras, ecological harm. And really that privileges the communities that were most harmed. And so that was sort of her framework. And in my mind, that's how I've spent a lot of my time, has been really looking at strategically places that are either because of human decision making. So we just finished a project dealing with the impact of freeways and urban renewal on communities and the disproportionate impact that had. And now that cities are becoming the places that are receiving investment and are having a renaissance, what do you do with these scars that were created by people, like not ecological, environmental, nothing. It's literally mindset and policy. So there's that whole realm of repair. But the other one is dealing with climate change and adaptation, and repairing our relationship with water in particular and carbon through design. And so it permeates a number of approaches, but that's sort of a big umbrella description of it.
I want to talk about the article you wrote entitled Black Landscapes Matter. I encourage listeners who haven't read it yet to definitely check it out. In the article, you outline 8 propositions for landscape architecture to better serve Black communities, Black landscape professionals through the tenets of to be seen, to live with dignity, and to be connected. You also mentioned that these were identified by Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, as underlying motivations for that movement. I was wondering if you could briefly go over some of the main takeaways from that article, and I'm also curious what, if any, response you have received to these proposals you've put forth.
Yeah, so that one, how that happened is interesting. I mean, these are ideas that are rolling around, and for people in the audience that are pursuing tenure in academic environment, it's not something you talk about until you get tenure. So you need some security before you lay it out. But I got a call out of the blue from my friend Walter Hood. And he goes, we're having this conference at Berkeley. You should come. It's called Black Landscapes Matter. And I said, well, can I get some more about it? What am I doing? It's like, are you going to be one of the speakers? I said, what should I talk about? And he's kind of like, you'll figure it out. And that was literally the conversation. So, it's rolling around in my head. And in landscape architecture, there are a number of folks who have been struck by how we define our history. And in the same way that the mainstream environmental movement was defined in certain ways that included some and excluded others, the mainstream definition of landscape architecture kind of fills that gap too. And so, I'm looking at other places and what we call creative production, that where the energy is, right? So you find young people who are just really on their own, just this insatiable kind of creative spirit, and they're making stuff and they're inventing stuff, but that's not happening in landscape architecture. And why is that? And then specifically, it's not happening for certain groups of people. And I think that I was inspired and continue to be inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement for a number of reasons. But one of them was I was really struck by, I heard a lecture that Alicia gave where she said that, right? And so it's not jargony, it's pretty clear, and it's what we intend to do, but it also highlights how far we have to go in order to do that. So, the being seen part of it is really a reflection on our own mission, the legacy of Africa and African American people from the profession of landscape architecture. So if people are like me, you read the Landscapes of Man when you were in school and things of that nature. Landscapes of Man, we can just kind of cut the podcast off there. But, so you hear a little bit about Egypt, there's a little bit about Islamic gardens, which were African people who, at that time, invaded Spain. But, really the practices, the mindset, the worldview of our relationship to the world in various cultures is absent. And then you find out that, much of the early wealth of our nation was based on slavery, and that in some cases, African-American enslaved people were not big, dumb brutes, that they were actually selectively identified and targeted because of their technical expertise and their skill set. So this idea of, we talked in the article about Middleton Place, which is one of the early rice plantations in Charleston, and at a time when South Carolina as a colony was struggling with a cash crop, right, that they were trying to justify their existence. They tried a few and things didn't work out. They hear about these folks in Sierra Leone and Senegal who've been growing rice, and they build dikes and they do the engineering. It's what we would call multiple professions, architecture, engineer. They would be like transdisciplinary if they're around today. They specifically targeted those people, and because a number of them had sickle cell disease, one of the silver linings of sickle cell disease is malaria resistance. And so if you imagine the swamps of South Carolina at that time, a lot of European colonial people couldn't work or operate there, right? So there were extended periods of time in the construction of this plantation where things were being built and designed by African people who brought that knowledge with them. They weren't taught it. And so that's just one small story, but you can go in many different areas and find everything that we call landscape architecture. Did they, conduct a site analysis per se? Or did they inventory things? Did they use critical problem solving to actually result in a built landscape? But yes, it checks like every box, but somehow that's not a part of it. And some of it is the toxicity of slavery, and it forces you to engage a different kind of conversation than just the technical execution of landscape architecture. It's political. But that was an example of being seen. Living with dignity is something that I really admired because, a number of the founders of Black Lives Matter were queer Black women, which, on the intersectionality conversation are just really in a different position than any of us. But the idea of living with dignity, it's not it's not requiring the solving of issues, but it means that there are things we can confer and convey to people to let them know that they are welcome and that they are present and that we value, their point of view that we don't do. And elevating stories is something that has inspired me in a great deal regarding that. And then being connected. And so in a more global world, that's really more about your networks, how still segregated much of our world is, either by race or class or gender, that we really tend to be in our own bubbles. And the people that are benefiting the most from this new economy are the people that are most connected. And so bringing that back to the legacy of Black landscapes and asserting why they matter was trying to look at our existing mainstream definitions in that way. And so, one of the propositions was, which, is pretty inflammatory, but it was kind of like, well, if these enslaved African people built all these places, then maybe we should just retroactively recognize them as landscape architects and embrace that legacy critically, right? So, it's not accepting it, saying that because they did it, everything was great, but that it's included within our canon. And there were other ones, campuses that were built by African-American people, designed by them. There's a whole legacy of places all over the world that they fit the bill, but they don't fit the mainstream. So that's the one that I think I've gotten a lot of responses from students who read it and have passed it along and found inspiration from it. Even colleagues who are professionals, it's given some cover for them. I'm an academic, so I can I don't have to worry about getting a client or something like that. As long as it's like academically rigorous, I get a pass. But the idea is that I think it's provided at least the beginnings of a foundation of saying that we need to, at this time, really rethink not just our pocket of it in terms of Black landscape architects, but all of landscape architecture, and all of those components. And for people who have been at the conference, I was on a panel with Sarah Zude, and she kind of took that ball and ran with it. And so her work in Brazil, her work in Seattle, with Africa Town, it's starting to result in work that is critical and challenging, but presenting how the advantage, the benefit, how it enriches the broader conversation landscape architecture, not a grievance or a thing on the side, but actually a leading way of framing our future. We don't really talk about the resource extraction, particularly in European colonial countries, and how that gave enough space, time, resources to produce, the great landscapes you see in France or in England or in other countries. I think we've detached that, and we kind of stay in the lane of garden design and how we evaluate a Versailles, or a major park is almost apolitical. It's sort of the arrangement of objects and that sort of thing. And I think that geographers, for example, are ahead of us and have been very critical about, you can't pull those artifacts out of their context. Like, there were real reasons why that occurred, and I think that landscape architecture could learn a lot from that, and not in a bad way, in a good critical way that helps us move forward.
I also want to get back to some of your other community engagement work, and a theme that I've noticed is the use of a variety of media and tools, including video. This has been deployed in some of your projects you mentioned, such as the Old Carver School Vision Plan in Idlewild, Michigan, or the Cell Phone Diaries for Chavis Park. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've used video and media in community engagement for those projects and how it challenges traditional approaches?
Yeah, I think that if you evaluate a lot of how we practice landscape architecture now, it's in the lane of fine arts tradition. It's what we learned from the Beaux-Arts, studio-based, drawing and physical model-based. And I think that's great. And as someone who enjoys doing that, I want to hold on to that. But I do know that we're in an environment where fewer and fewer children are getting exposed to art, at an early age, and the emphasis on STEM education and other things. We have a number of students who applied to our program who've never taken an art class before. And so how do you put them in that box, right, and say that's the only pathway to learning landscape architecture and participating? And when you deal with diverse communities, it's not to presume that they don't understand these tools, but a number of folks, there's a barrier to them being able to fully participate of just understanding and awareness. So can you read a map? Do you know what a contour is? If I show you a model, what ends up happening, at least in my experience, is that, communities, they kind of listen to what you say, and if they think that they can trust you, then they're willing to go along. So I've been grappling with how do we find a way to make landscape architecture more accessible with the tools that people are using already. And so the first experiment with it was Idlewild, Michigan. Idlewild was a very famous African-American resort in the early 20th century in the western side of Michigan that's come on some hard times, but is interested in regenerating and sort of leveraging that legacy. And the unfortunate part was the timing when we had a chance to get there to engage folks was the winter. And so growing up in Michigan, doesn't bother me, but most people aren't there during the winter. So we were thinking, well, what are we going to do to get the word out to it's at full sort of occupation during the summer? And so it started with, well, okay, maybe what we need to do is shoot some short videos and burn some DVDs, and then we can mail them out, to everybody. And then we'd have this survey, and then they could have like viewing parties. They could share with their friends. If they didn't understand something that was said, they could rewind, and we were like, it went further. We were like, man, we could get someone who speaks different languages to do, overdubs so that it's not English, preferential. We tried that. And so that was like the first experiment, and it flopped because we hadn't established a trust with the summer population. And so it didn't end up expanding. The winter did it, and it was great. But on the heels of that, and this shows how old I am, is smartphones and Google Maps had just kind of become, common. And it's very easy to link a phone to a location on a map with a few moves. And so we were working with the South Park, East Raleigh community on Chavis Park. Chavis Park was a 30-acre park in the middle of this community that held all this history. And we got a deal with AT&T for a month of phones and free service, and we did some trainings. And what was interesting was the group that kept the history in that community were senior African-American women who at that point had never really used a smartphone before. So, they were excited about getting a month of free service. To be honest with you, they could call their relatives and do that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But we were like, look, go out there, and go to the places that you like and talk about them. But hit record when you're talking and shoot a video, and it will link to that site. And there were a couple things that were important. We had traditional workshops going, community workshops, but those were kind of off the site, and they were in a basement of a church, and people had to recall, and there was a group dynamic, where the loudest voice wins and that sort of thing. So you'd get feedback, but it was kind of, in its lane. And there was another group that was really concerned about artifacts and yearbook pictures, archival things, but none of them were really in the place in real time getting people talking about them. So the exciting part is that these ladies produced about 57 videos of all kinds of things, and a lot of it was recalling things that had no trace evidence in the landscape, which is to say you could go out there yourself and you'd have no idea. And what was really cool about it was the city decided to show their videos projected on downtown buildings. And then other communities started copying the same technique, and they started doing the same thing, giving people phones and doing their thing. And then it went into part of the evidence. They're cited for the National Register of Historic Places, so this park got designated. It's the first African-American open space in Raleigh and one of few in the state with historic designation based on the power of these stories. And it also went into a master plan update that led to a $12.5 million bond issue for first phase renovations that are now starting to recover that history and give it form. And so it led to multiple steps, but the big point of it was trying to use the tools that are already in people's hands to empower them to impact the process.
In your role at NC State School of Design, you've also led the Ghana Study Abroad program and have taught courses in West Africa. I'm wondering if you could talk more broadly about the goals of that exchange program and what students who may not have any familiarity with Africa receive from the experience, but also vice versa, what the local African and, from what I understand, artists there perceive from their interactions as well.
Yeah, it was founded in the College of Design by a guy named Charles Joyner. He was a professor of art and design who's recently retired. And it was at the request of the then Vice Chancellor Witherspoon. He was the first African-American Vice Chancellor at NC State, who went over to Ghana, West Africa, to establish some linkage agreements with the university there called Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. And so they essentially have the same schools and departments that we do. And so he brought a representative of each college with him to interact with that partner and determine on their own what they wanted to do. So Charles set up a specific partnership with the art and design program over there. And it shifted. So when it started, Charles was most interested in artists and designers deriving inspiration from that experience to produce original works of art. And so you'd go to Ghana, and we would spend time in the craft villages. One thing that's interesting about Ghana, a lot of things interesting about Ghana. It's a young country, became independent in 1957. It is known as the Gateway of West Africa because it has a cultural reputation of being very welcoming and open. But a lot of their traditional arts and crafts are still practiced in the same ways. And a lot of things we associate with the whole continent of Africa actually come from Ghana. So, for example, kente cloth is a cloth that's associated with the Shanti region and the Shanti Empire, and people still weave it like they did, back in the day. And now it's like ubiquitous. You see it at graduations and that sort of thing. A dinkra cloth with the stamps, lost wax metal techniques, and so it's regionally specific. So you go to a particular town and people are doing it in the same way. So you go in the original model and observe and document the making of it. And through that process of traveling and documenting it, you come back and use those techniques to inform original works of art at that time. So I had started going with Charles in 2005. And when I went for the first time, I was looking at the settings where these things were occurring. And I said, these artifacts are beautiful, this process is amazing. But as a landscape architect, there's all these things that, could also be of a benefit. And we worked on it over time, but what it amounted to is in 2011 was, I think we had a breakthrough where we teamed with a non-government organization called Women in Progress, and they had a brand called Global Mamas, and it was designed to sort of lift Ghanaian women out of poverty. And so how they did that was these ladies had a cottage industry in their own backyards of making batik cloth, and they were able to put a social premium on the sale of their work. They'd sell to the West, essentially, and that added premium could get fed back into the program to help them develop business skills, to develop that sort of thing. So they had a specialty line of children's clothing, but they wanted two things. One was a lot of these ladies had never even really explored their own country. And so we were like, oh, that's something we could do. We do it anyway. So we developed, with the art and design students, a pattern book of palettes, patterns, traditions from all of the regions of Ghana that then they could use for inspiration on their own work. And they wanted to scale up their work from these individual cottages to a more consolidated facility, but they didn't want it to be a factory. They wanted it to have some characteristics of local culture. And so the landscape architecture students on that trip were studying these craft making places, and how you relate to family and children and food. It's like it's a different thing than what we think about in terms of a job. It's different, and use that to generate ideas that they could use to acquire property and to move forward with their operation. And that was a really great exchange. And I think that we did it again in 2014. It was even better. That one did get an ASLA award, actually, working with the Mofa Foundation on educational play experiences in Ghana that were grounded in Ghanaian culture and vision, because they viewed a lot of parks as sort of a colonial thing that the British brought with them when they colonized. And so the way that the British thought about parks is not how Ghanaians did. And so it was a really interesting sort of dialogue about, well, what is an authentic sort of Ghanaian experience in a major city? But the short version of it is that the artists, sometimes when you engage people, there's an assumption of a big gap in awareness and understanding, particularly in making and creative work and design. So a designer comes from elsewhere and works with a layperson in that particular country, and it turns into that kind of relationship. But what it did for our students is that it helped them understand that, no, we don't have the copyright on making or design. These are people who actually probably are better designers than we are, and that forced a different kind of exchange where it was almost peer-to-peer. And rather than one teaching another, people were teaching one another. Co-creation is what we call it now. And that, in a lot of ways, built trust. And I think the idea of contributing to something while we were there instead of reflective and producing something in absence was a major breakthrough. So now, we really enjoy that relationship, and we can see evidence that the things that were co-created between our students and the Ghanaian folks on the other side have led to other things. So you can see like 2 and 3 steps beyond our work, that they've been able to enable more resources, more interventions, that sort of thing.
We are in a field that could and needs to benefit from a more diverse practitioner base. In the article, Black Landscapes Matter, you wrote, it seems disingenuous to want to work in Black communities, but neglect to reflect deeply on the disconnect between our professional desires and our professional composition. Being in academia, I assume you're often on the front lines of student recruitment and career development. Yeah. So what do you see your role in aiding this, and what do you think overall the field could be doing better as a whole?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think we'll talk about the easier stuff first. I think that we already have diverse voices, practitioners, educators, projects, and we need to do more to kind of celebrate what we've already done and kind of put it in the front so that people don't see it as completely out of left field. They see that, we already, it's not to kind of assure you that everything's cool, but it's to say that we're not starting from zero. So I think recovering essentially how we describe our profession and presenting it to the world will make a huge difference. Building off of that, there were a number of student protests in the early 2000s, Black students in particular, and one of their major concerns was a lack of faculty and educators of color or who could really relate to their cultural experience. And the fact that our profession is an accredited profession, you have to go through an accredited program to then be able to sit for licensure, means that really reflecting on the classroom and the curriculum and the faculty in some more progressive ways, I think, could make a difference. And I think that, we have this conversation a lot on the board of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. We actually had our annual meeting right before the ASLA meeting, and this was a major topic. So we have a whole initiative on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is to say we're trying to transform our organization to be more inclusive and welcoming and accommodating to attract people, because it's one thing to proactively go after, recruit, bring people in, but if they come into a situation or a context where they don't feel that institution is really responding to what they need, then they're going to leave, And we actually sadly have a very high attrition rate in some cases early in student careers. So organizations, I think, have to reflect on themselves and learn ways to remake how they operate, and we had the Olmsted Scholars, for example, the Olmsted Scholar Program recognizes, outstanding students across the country. And one of their number one concerns was work-life balance. Mm-hmm. And, they were like, well, there are other things that I do that are important to me that aren't just landscape architecture, and I'm concerned I'm going to have to sacrifice that in order to pursue a career in landscape architecture. And that's not specific to people of color, Black people, or any gender or anything like that. Everybody has that kind of concern. But it's like the tip of an iceberg of a bigger set of questions about, is this profession really for me? How much do I have to change to fit into it? And how welcoming is it to receive me? And I think it's that second part that firms need to take a look at, that institutions need to take a look at in terms of how we practice and how we treat one another with respect and with equity and with sort of an even hand and justice. And I think that on the gender side, we're actually making some major strides. But I think in other categories, we just have a lot of work to do. Part of why I like landscape architecture and why I like doing what I do is I am hopeful for the future. I think that we can figure it out. We just don't have everybody in the pool yet. And I think that if we do that, then it will produce better responses faster and get us out of the trouble that we're in. So don't give up hope.
This episode was researched, produced, and edited by Joanna Karaman with coordination by Michael Todoran. Special thanks to ASLA for logistical support and additional music by Yohanan Samama. Further thanks to Kofi Boone for his participation and input. Please visit our website, larchitect.org, for more info. Until next time, the Larchitect team.